Hello, I'm Tom Stapledon, and I'm back once again with another one of my talks on a Joseph Williamson related subject on behalf of the Friends of Williamson's Tunnels. This time I'm going to talk about an event going back to 1999. Those of you who have followed these talks will probably know very well by now, because I've repeated so many things over and over, about the deep cellars below the set of buildings that Joseph Williamson put up at the top of Paddington in Edge Hill, and the discovery by us in July 1999, or rediscovery of this long lost deep cellar system below this building here. Just realized I haven't put my laser pointer on. There we go, it's on. So this is the set of buildings that Williamson put up at the top of Paddington around 1936 to 1940. They stood there until 1939, and then they were pulled down, and this set of buildings went up in their place. This is much later, of course. This is a photo from 1998. These buildings, 2 blocks of tenement block flats, called Paddington Gardens, went up on the site here, and this spot in front at the top of Paddington was where the Williamson buildings used to stand. Now, through the 1930s, when they realized that it was time to demolish all of these buildings, this whole block of land between Highgate Street, which is here, Paddington there, and Mason Street, the street below, was all being cleared bit by bit from about 1934 right through till 1938-39. The Williamson buildings and other shops on the frontage of Paddington here, I think, were probably just about the last to go. A lot of the buildings that have been put up on that area since Williamson's day ended up as being the worst of the worst. Slum housing, the court houses. This is what one of the courts looked like. Terrible deprivation in here. Hundreds of families crammed into a very small area with one tap, one toilet at the end of the street. The light would barely get through between the front of the houses. So they were awful things, and they were being gradually pulled down through the 1930s and the land cleared. Now, I have managed to get hold of snippets from the Planning Department and Housing Department minutes of meetings held by the council through these years. And it looks as if the problem of what to do with this piece of land was a real headache for the planners. They really didn't know what lay below, but they had suspicions that there were things below that ground that were going to make life very difficult for the building of anything large on this piece of land. It was suspected that there were Williamson underground structures that could make life much more complicated than an ordinary piece of land might have been. And they changed their plans on a number of occasions, drew up lots of plans, then changed them, then decided on something else. But eventually, by 1939, they had decided they were going to put up these 2 blocks, Paddington Gardens. And I think there was a good reason why they chose to put them as far apart as they did. This lower block on the westerly side of the block was facing onto Mason Street here, and the easterly block was facing onto Highgate Street, and they left this big gap in between. And I think the reason for that was they suspected there were all sorts of complications below ground there, possibly left behind by our man, Joseph Williamson. Now, these flats had probably been vacated and lying empty for a couple of years through the late 1930s. But then they were finally demolished in 1938. And here we are. They're finally coming down completely, and the land is being cleared. Now, when they went, we had got going as an organization and had become very interested in the story of Joseph Williamson and everything about him and what he'd been doing underground all those years earlier. And we had suspicions from our research work that there were definitely Williamson structures below this ground, and we wanted to try and find them. We didn't want them to see them bulldozed full of rubble and lost forever. And so I think it was down to us that a watching brief was conducted to oversee the process of clearing the land before the building of the new student flats commenced, which are now there now. Now, we were quite well in with the city architect. I'm sorry, no, the city archaeologist, a lady called Sarah Jane Farr, who we'd been working with over the previous couple of years over Williamson structures that we didn't want to see lost and bulldozed away. And I think she managed to organize this watching brief. And it was done in conjunction with museums on Merseyside. And an archaeologist by the name of Dr. Mark Adams was put in charge of this. In fact, he was a one-man band. And Dr. Adams was given the brief of overseeing the clearance of this land and exploring it before the new buildings were to be put up and before the foundations went down. Now, he had about a month. This watching brief took place in January of 1999. And by a few months later, the new flats were up and the land was covered again. But during that brief period of several weeks in January 1999, Dr. Adams was on site every day and watching the progress. He was able to direct digging in certain areas to try and uncover what he was hoping to see so that he could record what was found and take measurements and perhaps stop the digging for a while, but he wasn't going to stop things happening in the long run. Now, for some reason that I don't quite understand, two areas of the site were earmarked for the watching brief. This hatched area here, Area 1, and this one up here, which is labelled as Area 2. And they must have had some reason to suspect that there were things of interest under both of these areas, but they certainly weren't going to do the watching brief on the whole of the plot where the student flats were going to go and where the tenement blocks had been demolished. So right at the beginning of this process, when the demolition crew had moved out and the developers were moving in and levelling off the land and preparing to put down foundations, this appeared. Now this area here is actually an L-shaped cellar cut out of the sandstone rock, which we believe is probably down to Joseph Williamson. But it's been filled up in many parts by these great blocks of concrete, which are they've obviously been put down as supports for the Paddington Gardens flats when they came across dodgy ground, as they did. So there was not very much to be seen and not very much they could do about that one. But right next to it in the foreground of this picture, we have this one, which has been labelled up as cellar number 2. This is much more interesting. As you can probably see, this has had a brick arched roof over it. And as it turns out, it was at least a 2-level cellar system and very, very much looking like a Williamson structure. It had fireplaces on the first and second levels of the cellar, and obviously had been cellars underneath a building of some description. But of course, we don't know what the buildings were above there. And in the background there is Dr. Mark Adams. He's taking measurements on the ground and trying to get a record of everything that he comes across. And he's able to ask the diggers to clear places out so they can have a better look whenever he feels it's necessary. This one right next door was what was to become known as cellar number 1. This was a plain rectangular area cut out of the rock. Nothing very exciting about it, but it seems as if there was what looked like a set of steps going down in that corner. I've got a number of these photographs, so I'm just going to keep showing them to you. Another look at cellar number 2 there with cellar number 1 alongside. Now, these were quite dangerous structures. By the time they'd been uncovered like this, there was a lot of masonry wanting to just fall in on top. It was not a safe place for anybody to go down. So Dr. Mark Adams' job was really about recording things that he saw from the surface, and maybe just occasionally dropping a measure down to measure the total depth of what he sees and the width and the length and that sort of thing. But he certainly wasn't going to go down below to investigate any more than that. On this plan, we've superimposed on an older 1891 Ordnance Survey plan what we think we're looking at. Now, Paddington is up here, and this row of buildings are number 120, 122, 124, and 126 Paddington. That's the Williamson block. And beneath there, we now have a very deep cellar system, which we rediscovered later on in July of this same year. But at the time of this investigation, it didn't come to light. We didn't find a way into it until months later. But on this plan, we've marked here cellar number 1, which we've just been looking at, cellar number 2, and cellar number 3, which is this L-shaped one going right up to the side of Highgate Street here. Cellar number 4 is that one, and cellar number 5 is there. And there's another cellar down here in the other area. But this area was area number 2 of the watching brief, which took in all of these cellars, including cellar number 6 there, which is right behind the Williamson buildings and runs right up to the side of Highgate Street. The Area 1 area didn't turn out to be particularly exciting. We do know for a fact that this cellar here had been completely filled up with concrete. And so it's pretty obvious that this was lying beneath the footprint of the Paddington Gardens block. And they had to do that just to get solid foundations. And we think, well, we know that there was an air raid shelter here, and possibly an air raid shelter at this end as well. No mention of that in the watching brief, but this area had a, I don't know how deep, but it had an air raid shelter. And yet in the report that's been written up by Dr. Adams, which is fairly comprehensive, he doesn't really make any mention at all of the air raid shelter, except that possibly the entrance to it was through this cellar, which has been filled in with concrete, so they never got inside it. And I don't think there was anything else of interest in that area. Cellars number 4 and number 5, again, had been mostly filled up with concrete because they lay underneath the westerly block of the Paddington Gardens tenements. I'm just going to carry on showing these photographs because I've got them, and they show different angles on the same scene, basically. On the right there in the blue top is Dr. Adams. He's obviously talking to a couple of the contractors' men who probably work the diggers. He may be asking them, telling them what he would like them to do to open up this space, and so he could see what more is going on in there. Another one, cellar number 1 and cellar number 2 lying side by side. And then looking down towards the fireplaces at that end of both of these cellars. It doesn't show the fireplaces, but they're along there. And two flues could be seen on the surface. They were side by side. I think maybe it shows in the next picture. Yes, here it is. The double flue is there at ground level. One of those flues coming from the lower level fireplace, and the other one coming from the upper level fireplace. Would have gone right up through the building that lay above there, and right up through the building. Why they were occupied in cellars, we don't really know, but presumably they were designed that way. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been made with chimney breasts and fireplaces. So they must have been intended to be living accommodation right from the word go, even though it isn't normal for cellars under these sort of buildings to be used as living spaces. Again, you can see what a mess it is, and plenty of masonry just wanting to topple in on top, because they've only just uncovered it, something that's been full of rubble for years, and certainly not a safe place to be down below there. That's a better view of cellar number 1. We're told from the report that it had a wall across there, dividing it into two rooms, basically, there and there. These are orientated north-south. And there in that corner is what appeared to be a set of steps going down into that cellar. So that would be the entrance at that point. Looks like Dr. Adams is trying to measure the depth at this point to find out just how deep that cellar system goes. And obviously it is quite a long way down at this point. But he's just looking down into the dark depths and really hasn't got much idea of what lies below. And on his own, he wouldn't be able to write up very much by way of a meaningful report on what these rooms consisted of. This plan, not sure where this came from, it's been superimposed onto a plan of the Paddington Gardens tenement blocks. One block here, easterly block against Highgate Street, and the westerly block here against Mason Street. And as you can see, we've superimposed cellars 1, 2, 3, and that one I think is cellar 4. Cellar 4 definitely has been filled in with a lot of concrete, and cellar number 3 has had a lot of concrete poured in. These rectangular blocks are where the concrete's been poured to provide foundations for the flats that were going above. Not sure why I'm showing this one again. It's basically the same one I showed earlier. Pretty much filled with concrete there, number 4 and number 5. They weren't part of the watching brief, but there were occasional breaks in work when Dr. Adams was able to investigate a little bit when there wasn't anything very much else going on. So at least he knows that they were there and roughly what shape and size they were, but very little left to be investigated. Some of you who have been to my meetings talks regularly may have heard me talk about a story not so long ago, in the last couple of months, whereby some tunnels were unearthed running underneath Highgate Street from this land, right behind where the Williamson buildings were. And this may be at the point where that cellar number 6 is, because they could see 3 walls of cellar number 6, but they couldn't see the wall, the right-hand end there, where it disappears under the road. So they didn't know whether it actually continued underneath the road or whether it ended at the side of the road. But some of you may remember this drawing that came up, drawing by Myrtle Seymour from 1938, showing the tunnels under Highgate Street exposed. It seems that in 1938, there was a collapse. Now, this would have been when the land was being cleared of the Williamson buildings and all the other buildings on Highgate Street. And before the Paddington Gardens flats went up, there was a collapse either in the road or in the pavement. And this photograph this line drawing made at that time is looking from behind the Williamson buildings across to the other side of Highgate Street, where this building stands, which I've talked about, Derby House on the other side of the road. Now, this may be the point where cellar number 6 actually goes under the road, or could it be cellar number 3 that goes under the road? Or is it neither? Is it an extension of cellars that were actually underneath Williamson's own buildings? Because we were told that there were bakery ovens in tunnels running under the street at this point. But one way or another, these have been exposed on 2 occasions. This happened in 1938, and then it's happened again in 1999, when there was a collapse in the pavement at around this spot, and tunnels were seen. So definitely it looks as if something was going underneath the street from that point. We have some homemade video taken by our Les Coe, who was on site during some of the days when this excavation work was going on, and the watching brief. This is not very clear. These are just snapshots from the video footage, which itself was quite primitive at that time. But it shows Dr. Mark Adams here conducting operations and asking the digger driver to move rubble from certain areas so that he can see better what's going on below ground. Here's another one just a still from the video. And then at some point, Dr. Adams has made the decision that he wanted to know more about what lay below. But he certainly wasn't going to go down there. He's an archaeologist. He's not a man who wants to take his life in his hands. But they pulled in a contractor who was prepared to go down. And this was a man called Mick Murphy, whose company was called, excuse me, Europa Rope Access Technicians. And he's this man here just climbing out of the excavation up a rope ladder. He was pulled in to go down below and have a look around, report back on what he saw, take rough measurements, and give an idea of what the layout was below ground. So at this point, Mick Murphy has been down below there into the 2 levels of cellars that were accessible, and he's now climbing back up the rope access ladder, a rope ladder, being helped out by his colleague on the surface. And here he is now. He's explaining to Dr. Adams what it is he's seen below ground. And Dr. Adams will be taking notes later, recording what he's been told by Mick Murphy about the actual layout and size and shape of the cellars below ground. He's pointing at something he's just been looking at down below there. He's actually now alongside our dear departed Steve Moran, one of our founder members, who was there right at the beginning and was here on site during this particular time. And I know for a fact from the video footage that we've got that after Mick Murphy had been down there and reported back, Steve asked if he could be allowed to go down himself and have a look. I would imagine that both Dr. Adams and Mick Murphy might have been a little bit hesitant about an amateur being allowed to go down there. But they obviously decided that they would allow Steve to go. And I have it on video footage at one point in this video. Steve is loading a new film into his camera, ready to go down below, and intending to take photographs and have a good look around himself. And here we have Steve on his way down, being lowered into the cellar. It was quite funny actually on the video footage. He's flailing around all over the place at some point. I can't remember whether it was going down or coming out. Legs all over the place, trying to get his footing on a swinging rope ladder in the middle of the air. So, but he did it. He got in and he got out. And now, after Steve died, there was an enormous amount of material to be collected from his house. He had surrounded himself with so much written and photographic material concerning everything he knew about the tunnels. He took thousands of photographs everywhere and anywhere. And clearing his house of all FoWT related material was a massive job for a large number of us, with cars and trailers, and finding homes for it was a massive job as well, because nobody wanted to take it all in or had the space. I was one of the people who managed to take a lot of material from Steve's, including thousands of photographs. And when I went through them, I wasn't the only person to go through them all, but I did. I never found a single photograph taken by Steve inside this cellar system. But I knew he'd been down there, and I knew he'd been with the camera because it's on video. So by sheer luck, I only thought about the idea for this talk a few weeks earlier. And I'd had a second box of photos that emerged, which came to me after 8 years since Steve had died. And I was going through these photographs after I decided to do this talk. And just by sheer coincidence, 3 more photographs appeared that I had never seen before. All his photos were mixed up and jumbled. Many were missing and there were only negatives, but I found 3 photographs taken down below there. And this is the first of them. This red bag has been lowered down on a rope with Steve's camera in it, and he's now down below, and that's the first of 3 photographs I have of what he took down below. I'm not quite sure what that one is looking at, or whether it's the first level, or I presume it's the first level cellar. But we were told from the report by Dr. Mark Adams and by Mick Murphy that in the lower level there had been a water storage tank constructed. And this is it. We're looking north towards the back of where the Williamson buildings had stood. We have a solid sandstone wall at the end, which is typical Williamson. This would have been cut straight out of the sandstone rock as a rectangular shape and then arched over in brick. But here at the northern end of this cellar number 2, somebody had constructed a solid water tank out of brick, and that is its back wall, rendered with this hard grey render designed to make it waterproof. So that's looking towards the back wall of this water tank, with Steve being inside it. And there's looking back in the other direction, to the direction that he's come from. He's gone over with a rope into the water storage tank, and he's obviously come through the roof into the lower chamber from above in the top level, and all this rubble has been poured down below. I should have mentioned, it shows in one of the earlier photographs that a great lump of brick masonry is lying across the top of a hole that was here. And when they first uncovered the top level, what they could see was a beautifully crafted manhole in the middle of the floor of the upper level down to the lower level. And it appeared to be a ring of sandstone, like a donut-shaped ring of sandstone. And at one point on the video, there is a discussion whereby the digger driver who was there at the time was being told that when he accidentally tried to lift this block of masonry out, and it accidentally dropped out of the bucket and fell back into the excavation, it smashed right through where the manhole had been and took it out, and it all went down below into the lower level. So that feature was lost completely, but at least it was recorded that it was there. And in this diagram drawn up by Dr. Adams, we've got cellar 1 and cellar 2 side by side, steps going down into cellar 1, as we saw in one of the photographs. At this end of cellar 2, we have the 2 fireplace flues side by side. There was a wall across the middle separating this into 2 separate rooms. And the dotted lines in here depict the lower level of the 2 levels of cellars. At this end here, in the lower level, is the area that was turned into a water storage facility, and the wall built across it appears to have a curved outer edge for some reason. Not sure whether that is for extra strength to hold back the water, but I imagine that's probably it. And something else is described here. This is in the top level, and it's a brick-built plinth, and I think it was 1 meter high. It may have been higher originally. It may have been where the entrance was. Maybe steps came down here. And then from this plinth, there were 3 sandstone steps going down to a lower level, and that is where the manhole was sited. But as I say, this great lump of masonry was dropped right down and through the hole and demolished it. And presumably that happened before there was any possibility of taking a photograph, because I've not seen any photographs of that at all. Can't quite imagine what this plinth is all about, or whether there were steps coming down here. But there was definitely this feature here, which is a chute. Something must have been shot down from above, down this chute in the side wall. And somewhere along the sides, there were also smaller holes, which we think were for ventilation. Because if you're going to have fires in cellars 2 levels below ground, you need fresh air getting in as well. Otherwise, you're in real trouble. Another feature that was pointed out was that on the floor of cellar number 1, there was a lot of coal dust and soot. And so the assumption's been made that perhaps that was used for coal storage. But unfortunately, that's about all we know about it. And all this is now filled up by the developers, built over the top, and that's what's sitting there now. And this is our compound and our entrance to the cellars that we discovered later that year in July of 1999. But the cellars lie underneath this area, the frontage of the student flats that have been built there now, and off to the left where it adjoins Highgate Street. So that's about all I've got to say on that subject. It was a useful job to be done. It told us something about Williamson and the things he was doing in this area. And whether that two-level cellar that we found actually went down to a third level or not couldn't be verified. There wasn't time, and there wasn't anybody prepared to dig it out, I suppose. And it had to all be filled in anyway. So that's about the end of that story. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you for listening.